This series is going to be a bit different from my other stuff because it focuses more on context than anything else. To give you a peek under the hood of my video making process, this is a topic that has actually been present in the scripts of many of my recent videos, and I always cut it out because it always ends up being too much of a tangent. Having said that, I think it was a blessing in disguise because it's given me some time to really let this idea mature into something that I believe is worth its own pieces of content. Beyond that, I feel that it is a crucially important video if you want to understand Aikido, both historical and current. However, I do want to start with a disclaimer. My experience is that when this information is presented, it tends to receive one of three reactions. The first is acceptance, which is, of course, healthy and what we'd hope to see. Generally, though, people don't accept it. In my experience, people either reject it outright or attempt to suck all the nuance out of the situation to support something they already believe. Make no mistake, I find both of these extreme reactions to be almost fanatical in nature. Those who reject the information tend to be Aikido purists who have never, and possibly will never, look at the history and instead choose to blindly believe a marketing campaign that I will unpack over the course of this series. On the other hand, people who try to encapsulate everything I'm about to go over here into social media friendly phrases like Aikido was a scam all along or something in line with that are just as ideologically motivated as the deniers. The reality is that this isn't a story that neatly fits into the most popular conceptions of Aikido. The people are neither scam artists nor entirely honest. Events are not wholly good or bad. This is something I would strongly suggest viewers keep in mind and do their best to put themselves in the shoes and time periods of our subjects as much as possible. While a lot of cultural studies these days seem to be almost myopic in their scope, I believe it's crucial to talk about the broader cultural trends to everyday people. It seems to me that many people are just disconnected from these larger cultural beats, and the result of that is that things seem to happen almost by surprise and very much confuse folks. By comparison, a more culturally and historically literate population would probably not have to ask, how did we get here? Nearly as much, at least. Reasons behind events would just be self-evident. Aikido is similar to this because as much as it is a martial art, it is also a specific moment in time. Beyond that, martial arts tend to be surprisingly convincing microcosms for broader social trends. Unfortunately for we in the English-speaking world, the context of Aikido is a lot more difficult for us to grasp, given we have to penetrate a foreign culture, foreign language, and foreign history to really wrap our minds around it. In my experience, people both inside and outside of Aikido practice tend to approach it in a kind of vacuum. There appears to be this underlying assumption that the style just spontaneously generated itself, but no tree grows in ignorance to its climate. Now, that isn't to say people believe it just popped into existence one day, but just that this whole tale sort of gets hand-waved as technically and substantially immaterial. Before I jump headlong into this topic, though, I want to be crystal clear that what follows is not something that is strictly academic in nature. I will bring up many examples, pieces of history, and data where applicable. Supplemental sources will be also available in the description. However, I am heavily interpreting these things through my own experiences. I would best describe what follows here as a framework more than a hard, fast history, although again, sources and readings in the description. Gaps in what we know do require a bit of speculation to fill in, although I've done my best to be transparent about when I'm making these kinds of fill-in statements. With all of that housekeeping addressed, I want to start off here not with Aikido, but with some of the things going on in Japan leading up to Aikido's founding proper. This is going to be a bit of a whirlwind through a much, much more complex history, but for our purposes, I'm really only focusing on some key events. First, and really the inciting incident of our whole story, is the arrival of the Americans in Japan and the forcing open of the nation. Whole volumes have been written on the political, cultural, economic, and ideological fallout of this event, and I'm not going to mislead you in trying to summarize all of that in a few lines of script here. Instead, let's keep our eyes on the broad strokes. The Japanese military government falls, and power is ostensibly returned to the emperor. Early in this Meiji restoration, several laws are promulgated that abolish not only the samurai class, but even their physical identifiers, such as carrying swords or dressing like them even. Keep in mind, though, that writing a law that abolishes a samurai class isn't really the same as destroying their societal influence. Many industrial, military, and political figures came from samurai blood, samurai wealth, and samurai connections, even into the modern day, but especially in the lead up to World War II. If I had to make an unsavory comparison, consider what old money meant in the era immediately after the American Civil War in the South. These were families who would continue to hold great influence in the region, primarily derived from wealth gained through a mostly abolished system. Turning back to Japan, in the late 1860s and early 1870s, Hokkaido begins to become more widely populated as the government subsidizes land reclamation and immigration to the island. Foreign advisors are brought in from America to help the Japanese change the Hokkaido wilderness into agriculturally viable land. These efforts are widely successful. The land is reshaped into the Meiji image. Forests are felled, and even an entire species of wolf is driven to extinction. The native Ainu population is aggressively suppressed. It is worth noting here that Ueshiba, founder of Aikido, took part in these programs, which lasted well into the 20th century, as a homesteader and frontiersman. It is no historical mistake that he would meet his teacher, Takeda Sokaku, in a Hokkaido inn, nor is it coincidence that the Aiki shrine is built on Hokkaido soil. Around the same time that all of this is happening, Okinawa is formally incorporated as a Japanese prefecture in 1879. It had previously been a part of the Satsuma domain under the Tokugawa shogunate, that is the predecessor government to the Meiji Restoration, but in operation, it might be best to think of the island as a satellite tributary state in many ways, especially at this time. Something I think lost on many people is that Okinawa was originally the Ryukyu Kingdom, and while the people there hail from the same ancestry as neighboring East Asian states, they were their own culture. They still technically are today too, but much like the Ainu, have been heavily Japanized. The point I'm making with these digressions into Hokkaido and Okinawa is that this is a time of Japanese expansion. We think of these places today as inseparable from the classic shape of Japan on our own world maps, but in the late 1800s and early 1900s, these were exotic places that were either untamed, foreign, or some mixture of the two. Needless to say, this was a trend that would continue. Japan annexed Taiwan in 1895 after the First Sino-Japanese War and gained a foothold on the Chinese mainland after the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, just 10 years later. Obviously, all of this clearly demarcated Japan as a colonial power, and we could argue about when Japan truly evolved to its pre-war peak, but at the bare minimum, this was a premonition of empire. At the same time all this is happening, domestic Japan is changing internally at a breakneck pace, no less. It flips from an isolationist state with deeply conservative sentiments to an almost viciously progressive state that suddenly was starved for everything its global peers had to offer it. It sent delegations to Germany, America, England, and France to learn military technology and doctrine, among many other nations. It imported not only foreign culture, but foreign professionals, such as the aforementioned agriculturalists. Even architects and chefs were among those brought into the country. We can see the fingerprints of this initiative in the beautiful Tokyo train station, or even in the Hamburg steaks of modern Japan. All of this is the backdrop to what is going to happen in the martial arts world, and I'm telling you this to really drive home the fact that the word change almost doesn't really encapsulate the scale of dynamism going on here, especially given that time period. If you were an Edo-born person in, say, 1845, by the time you were 75, assuming you made it to that age, the city might as well have been a different planet compared to your early years. I really can't understate how much changed in Japan over the course of a single generation. If we compare that to the grander scope of Japanese history more generally, or even the history of other countries, this is sort of like waking up one day a medieval power and transforming into a first-rate modern global superpower by bedtime. In those terms, it's kind of insane, and I really think has only been replicated by contemporary, primarily coastal, China between 1970 or so and now. China, of course, isn't a perfect analogy. By 1905, Japan had a world-class navy, for example, perhaps the strongest in the world at the time even. Current-date China doesn't really seem to have a military proportional to that feat, but modern China is inarguably an economic superpower, something it achieved in about a single generation in much the same way that Japan achieved it a century prior, by sending delegations abroad and opening up to global influence. So, if the vector of the times in Japan is change, Judo and the larger Budo movement it inspired should be an almost obvious development to you. Judo and its founder, Kano, really are a product of the Meiji Restoration, and I think our tendency to divorce the art from that context makes Judo seem far more revolutionary than it actually was. Now, do not misunderstand me. I'm not trying to take anything away from Kano here, because when push came to shove, he was the guy who concocted the formula for Judo's success. All I am saying here is that Kano lived in a Japan where the resting state of culture was rapid change. If Kano hadn't built Judo, I personally suspect someone was eventually going to look around and realize that the globalist approach being applied to nearly every other aspect of society could be applied to martial arts too, and that is exactly what Judo is. It is a art that is broadly influenced by foreign ideas, but is a reinvention of traditional concepts. I know some people will say that Judo invented free sparring, for example, but that's far from the truth. Something that I think is uniquely Kano's brilliance, though, is something he doesn't get a lot of credit for, which is the narrative control he had over his emerging Judo. This, to me, is one of those key concepts in predicting if a martial art will be successful down the line. There are other components to such predictions, don't get me wrong, but I think what I'm about to describe is one that almost no one discusses despite how big of a deal it really is. I hope you're paying attention, because here it is. The story of Judo is the story of Meiji Japan. Consider this. Judo is a new art born out of a uniquely Japanese cultural background, but it has been updated by new technologies, pedagogies, and approaches as introduced by a newfound globalist paradigm. After emerging as this innovative, updated martial art, it then starts defeating old jujitsu schools, clearly eclipsing the old with the new. Finally, Judo is exported from Japan to almost the whole world, mirroring a Japan now becoming empire. The cultural narrative of Judo and the cultural narrative of the Meiji-era Japan are the same story. I'll break from Japan here for a moment to give another example of this concept in action, just to show that it's not a one-off. In the United States, right now, BJJ is freakishly and explosively popular, almost, in my opinion, to the point of oversaturation. Consider the following. An immigrant art arrives in the United States and eventually works itself up to a grand stage, UFC 1 and 2, where it reverses a traditional paradigm in martial arts. At this point, the humble immigrant is a self-made success and begins to spread across the nation in almost a manifest destiny. Beyond that, it preaches a relatable formula for success to would-be practitioners. No matter who you are, or where you come from, or even your age, if you work diligently, this is an art you can succeed in. Finally, this heavily Americanized BJJ explodes globally, and seems to have at least some presence in every corner of the globe. Does this story sound eerily familiar to my American viewers? The story of BJJ is really the cultural mythology of America itself. Now, I'm not trying to make a political statement here. I understand there is contention over the viability of the American dream, but I'm not really talking about whether or not the narrative reflects an objective reality or not here. What I'm saying is that the average American tends to identify with this narrative on some level. It encapsulates progress defeating tradition, outsiders becoming insiders, rags to riches, and the eventual cultural conquest of the globe. So really, in the same way that Judo's popularity is kind of obvious given its context, it really shouldn't surprise anyone that an art that essentially epitomizes the American dream, at least in marketing and in cultural myth, is a massive hit in America. Anyway, back to Japan. While I think Judo is kind of the avatar of Meiji-era sentiment in the martial arts sphere, keep in mind that karate also arrives on the mainland in the 1920s. Much to the chagrin of a certain slice of contemporary karate folk, the karate that Japan imported was heavily curated for the Japanese people. I'd also posit that the dropping of clinch work, which arguably is the core of so much original Okinawan karate, was also likely done so as to not compete with the behemoth that Judo had at that time now snowballed into. I bring up karate here, though, because unlike Judo, karate would have been almost a foreign martial art. I know I just said it was heavily modified for import, but the general population would not have been widely aware of that. Plus, it was kind of a process that happened quietly through first and second generation mainland students and teachers. What I want to stress here instead is that Okinawa is freshly a Japanese prefecture in the 1920s by just 40 or 50 years. To the average Japanese person at that time, it would be almost a foreign martial art in that sense. Again, using an American analogy here, it might be like a traditional martial art from Puerto Rico or Guam being imported to the US mainland and updated for popular success. Puerto Rico and Guam are indeed a part of U.S. territory, but if you ask the average American about the country's geography and its general shape on the globe, these places typically are not going to come up. This isn't a perfect comparison because Okinawa had become a prefecture, which is roughly analogous to an American state, but we have to imagine there was a sentiment that Okinawa was sort of this far-flung place that was different from the traditional Japanese cultural centers, and this, again, was a sign of the times. If Judo represented the rapid domestic changes of the Japanese mainland, then karate was the bannerman for the expansion of Japanese borders. All of this finally, at last, brings us to Aikido, which is markedly different in character to Judo and Karate in this context. But I'm going to save that for part 2. In the previous part of this series, we've discussed the historical background of the Meiji Restoration and how Judo and Karate very much matched the tone and cultural narrative of that period, which finally brings us to Aikido. I know it's been a long way to get here, but now that all that groundwork has been laid, we get to actually discuss the main topic. Aikido is different from Judo and Karate in the sense that rather than being a product of the era, it is almost a critique of the Meiji Restoration in the form of a martial art. Aikido is, in a sense, a retro throwback, even as it is founded in the 1920s, and actually predicts an interesting cultural trend before it really takes full effect, because everything that happens in the lead up to World War II in Japan is essentially a conservative throwback in reaction to the unbridled changes of the Meiji era. So, I want to unpack what I mean by a cultural throwback. You will note that Aikido is primarily made up of techniques that Judo and Karate both largely discarded. I'm not arguing that this was by design, but I am suggesting it feels almost like a fated coincidence. We could look at this in market terms and explain it as the art capitalizing on an underexplored niche. I think that's valid, but I primarily want to look at it from a cultural angle for the purposes of this video series. Takeda Sokaku, Ueshiba's teacher, is a man I would characterize as a samurai born just slightly too late to be a samurai. I don't want to completely rehash Ellis Amdur's work on Takeda from his book Hidden in Plain Sight here, as I strongly recommend that you read that for more detail. However, to summarize the main thrust of that section of the book, it is that Takeda was imbued with the values of an era that was already gone by the time he was a fully grown man. And this is a really interesting feature of culture, I think. Forgive me, my non-American friends, for my excessive American analogies in this series. It's just what I know. But I want to segue into the American Wild West here just for a split second. I think this is a natural comparison to make, as the Wild West and Tokugawa-era samurai stories have been riffing on each other for a pretty long time now. Look no further than Kurosawa Akira's The Seven Samurai and John Sturge's The Magnificent Seven films, which are literally the same story. The point I want to make here by bringing up the Wild West is how a cultural moment tends to reverberate for much longer than it tangibly exists. A fantastic example of this is the future movie star, so famed for his Wild West roles, John Wayne, meeting an elderly Wyatt Earp and drawing inspiration from him. Wyatt Earp, of course, being a famous Old West lawman who, like so many of his era, was only dubiously a hero figure. By the time Wayne met Wyatt Earp in 1928, the Wild West had firmly calcified into the Old West. Perhaps Earp could have told Wayne about what it really meant to be a man in his era, or how to gunsling, but these were sentiments from a place that only physically still existed. It was culturally already deceased. Wyatt Earp was a man from a ghost time from which only tales and memory remained. Yet while one could no longer visit the Wild West, it would, through people like John Wayne, go on to become an immutable piece of American mythology and self-image. Even so, the transition from Wild West to Old West wasn't exactly announced or anything. It isn't like the American government one day announced that the frontier is quote-unquote over. I suppose we could loosely attach a date to some legal declaration or policy, but I find that reductive. The Wild West wasn't purely the result of government policy or a lack thereof. It was also about the people who went there and the lives they led, sometimes in spite of the government. Due to this ambiguous transition period in which the Wild West becomes the Old West, we have to imagine that, at some point, young men, all hyped up on stories of wealth and adventure, rode west in search of these promises, only to find that the West they had heard about just didn't exist anymore. They had the souls of cowboys in an era that had obsoleted the condition of cowboys. My reading of Takeda Sokaku is the same. He was a samurai too late, wandering in a world that had outgrown him. Or had it? You see, Japan in the mid to late 1920s and certainly the 1930s was about to experience a slide into militarism and ultra-conservatism. Keep in mind that we in the West often characterize this authoritarian slide as a departure from the Meiji norm, but I would suggest that it was a reaction to the Meiji Restoration and something akin to a throwback to the shogun's military government that preceded it. The emperor gets a lot of press in the World War II period as being the guy at the levers of power, but this is actually pretty disputed in scholarly circles. If you read the minutes of his war councils, it was essentially a handful of the most powerful generals in the country with the full sway of the military at their backs making decisions and then turning to the emperor and saying, "This is the correct course of action, right, sir?" Now, I'm not trying to give Emperor Hirohito here a pass either. From a moral standpoint, maybe he could have just put his foot down and accepted that he'd likely be replaced. But perhaps he thought he had to remain there as the last holdout of human sanity for the sake of the Japanese people. I feel that his actions immediately after the war, in which he willingly submitted himself personally to MacArthur, carrying only the request that, in return for his submission, the occupiers not go too hard on the Japanese people. I find that this could very well be a window into the heart of his true intentions in terms of staying on as emperor and not putting his foot down, but maybe I'm giving him too much credit. Regardless, scholars still debate the emperor's guilt in orchestrating and perpetuating the war. Personally, I feel he was definitely a flawed man who made grave mistakes, but I have the aching suspicion he knew things were over long before his generals did, and likely genuinely cared about the welfare of Japanese citizens. That is beyond the point, though. What I want to direct your attention towards is that it wasn't the emperor unilaterally calling the shots. It was the military simply using the emperor as a kind of skin suit to present their own plans to the Japanese public. World War II Japan was an authoritarian military government. It was a throwback to the authoritarian military government of the Tokugawa shogunate in all but superficial aesthetics. In other words, the Meiji Restoration was a mere interlude, and the emerging militarism was a conservative return to form. I don't think it is a mistake that this is the era in which the Hagakure is tapped to help define an ahistorical mythologizing of the so-called warrior's code, or Bushido as it is known. Keep in mind that the Hagakure was written by a samurai who never actually saw combat and was kind of regarded as a madman in his own lifetime. Historically, there really was no creed like that of Bushido, and it is much easier to find historical examples of samurai defying its supposed tenets than embodying them. This, however, did not matter in the end. Much like we Americans romanticize the anti-heroes of the Wild West, narrative mythology was more powerful than historical fact in regard to Bushido. It was made much more accessible and more official, too. The term became propagandized by the ultra-right-wing government, and the story it told was weaponized to immense and tragic effect. So powerful is the Bushido mythos that it inspired young men to fly their planes into warships, and today it captures the imagination of would-be martial arts practitioners. Never mind that Bushido is an ahistorical, fabricated tradition devised by an imperial power that would ultimately lean on it to justify heinous crimes. In many ways, this is the movement that Daito-ryu and Aikido grew out of, though. These were conservative arts that concerned themselves heavily with the characteristics and techniques that the more liberal arts of Judo and Karate had discarded. Meaningfully, Aikido really concerned itself with the katana as well, which Judo and Karate broadly did not. It should go without saying that the sword was the very symbol of the samurai. The messaging here is clear in this context. We reject the Meiji-era thesis, and we are going back to the Japan promised in the Edo period. Now, this is not to say that judo and karate were necessarily progressive elements in all this, to be perfectly clear. They would eventually be subsumed by the Budokukai, a deeply nationalist organization, and plenty of ultra-nationalist sentiments would flow through those arts and organizations too. Please do not get it twisted. This is not a case of good guys versus bad guys here. This is more like ultra-conservative and pretty conservative. Nor was it like Aikido people and Judo people were in the streets counter-protesting one another either. The point I'm making here isn't to illustrate some kind of internal disagreement in the Japanese martial arts, but to demonstrate that Aikido was very much a conservative reaction, while Judo and Karate were more of a progressive product, even if a lot of their members had very ultra-right-wing sympathies. Again, don't get it wrong, the martial arts space in general in any country, but especially East Asia, tends to be pretty conservative. This, of course, is especially visible in Aikido's many ultra-nationalist and militarist sponsors. It is also reflected in Aikido's founder himself, Ueshiba, just casually letting young radicals plan coups in his property, among other very extreme right-wing activities. Nothing says love and peace like being silently and knowingly complicit in political violence. Am I right? But stick a pin in that, I'm going to come back around to it. We also need to point out here Ueshiba's chosen religious path with the Omoto-kyo organization. Whole books could very well be written on this topic, but I want to distill it down to its bones for the sake of digestibility here. Omoto-kyo had plenty of ultra-right-wing links and was primarily a kind of modern fan fiction continuation of the narrative thrust found in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki. For those who have no idea what those are, they are basically the master texts of Japanese native religion. Now, we have to be very, very careful here. Note that I did not call Japan's native religion Shinto. The reason for this is that state Shinto is an invention by the government in the lead-up to World War II in an attempt to quote-unquote purify religion from foreign influences, including things like Buddhism. The issue with this is, of course, it's impossible. Whatever traditions were originally practiced on the Japanese archipelago had long been syncretized on an atomic level with Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and all flavors of regional shamanism for well over a millennium and a half. There really isn't any telling where one religion ends and another begins. Sure, there are old texts, but there is no guarantee those hadn't been influenced by the mainland as well. They could also have just been one-offs, not really representing a widespread practice. Basically, only the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki were definitely considered to be uncontestably quote-unquote pure, but everything that came out of those and supporting documentation were a reconstruction at best, not a magical resurrection of a supposedly uninfluenced pure Japanese spiritualism as practiced by the Yamato people some 1500 years ago. By the way, this state-sponsored creation is the Shinto that still exists today. In fact, if you know where to look, this movement of purification of foreign influences can be found kind of all over the place in Japan, even in everyday vocabulary. For example, baseboru, obviously an imported word for baseball, was changed to yakyu, which is deemed ostensibly more Japanese because it uses Japanese characters, I guess. The shallowness of this rhetoric is, of course, clearly on display, as it isn't like baseball itself was ever abolished or changed fundamentally to be more Japanese. It was just the name. It was a coat of paint. Long story short, though, Ueshiba's faith was essentially built on this parallel state Shinto premise. Although the Omoto-kyo would come into conflict with the government, I again don't want you to confuse this for one being quote-unquote good and the other bad. Both were essentially ultra-nationalist conservative throwbacks, ostensibly to a pure Japanese age. I want to wrap back around to the concept of throwbacks in a moment, but first I feel like this is the logical place to discuss the point of Aikido. In an effort of full transparency, what I'm about to describe to you is very much my reading of Ueshiba's intentions for the art. You can find the bulk of his beliefs in the book Takemusu Aiki, which is untranslated and, in my opinion, a very difficult read in Japanese even. I recently ran across Byung-Chul Han's book, and please absolutely point out my pronunciation errors on this man's name. But anyway, his book, The Disappearance of Rituals, a Topology of the Present. Though, and while this book has absolutely nothing at all to do with Aikido, I found his definition of ritual to be useful in understanding Aikido's role in Ueshiba's overarching philosophy. It seems to me that Aikido was designed to be a ritual before it was considered a martial art. The idea was to create a communal activity of shared experience. To give an example, people around the world tend to understand the concept of a birthday and why it's important. So, in a sense, it creates a community that transcends borders, culture, politics, ethnicity, and whatever other categories might divide us. Aikido, then, was a technology attached to an imperial philosophy designed to be exported. This is to say, Aikido was meant for people around the world to move in the same way and, through this shared experience, come to understand the same values. In this case, an imperial Japanese worldview with the emperor and Japanese pantheon at its core. Make no mistake, I very much read Aikido's initial purpose as being a colonial tool. This, to me, always explained why such a deeply conservative man as Ueshiba would openly accept foreigners as students, while those around him clearly disliked the idea, even after the war sometimes. That is because, in a way, Aikido was for the foreigners. It was a ritual vocabulary to help them understand and value the imperial Japanese worldview, or perhaps the Omoto-kyo worldview, or just Ueshiba's worldview. But at any rate, it was ritual. To Ueshiba, these were probably all close to the same thing anyhow. None of this is to say that Aikido wasn't designed for Japanese people in mind too, however. Most Japanese people in Ueshiba's era didn't really understand the Kojiki or anything like that. In that sense, it was a tool for domestic education and a way to bring out practitioners' so-called Japanese-ness. Now, I do believe it overall failed in this, partially because Ueshiba was a horrible verbal communicator, and honestly, he really didn't write that much either, but this does appear to have been the idea. It's why he even spent so much time lecturing before practice. This appears to be Aikido's first and foremost role. Yes, it was absolutely a martial art too, so don't go thinking that I'm not saying it is. And it's clear Ueshiba thought of it as a martial art as well. To him, though, ritual and martial practice were basically synonyms. While his students might have gritted their teeth and struggled through Ueshiba's sermons on the Kojiki so they could finally practice techniques, to Ueshiba himself, the techniques were the sermon and vice versa. In short, the purpose of Aikido was essentially imperial and colonial in nature. If Judo was the avatar of the Meiji period and karate the avatar of early Japanese expansionism, then Aikido was the avatar of imperial Japan, the colonial empire. Let's refocus on the concept of throwbacks, though, which aren't at all random, necessarily at least. They tend to show up when things are going bad for a society, or when the change is happening just too quickly for the people's tolerance threshold. What I am suggesting here is that these kinds of cultural throwbacks are probably predictable and have predictable features. I am not at all a social scientist or economist, but I'd at least make an educated guess that when the middle class gets below a certain income growth level relative to inflation and GDP growth, plus their happiness drops, plus they feel that social changes have begun to depart too severely from traditional values, that is a cocktail for these kinds of cultural throwbacks. I believe this also explains why change in a country like modern Japan tends to happen on a more gradualist model. Big changes will freak people out and trigger a slide towards conservatism, and this is oftentimes associated with a call to pursue an idealized, though often fictionalized, past. When change is introduced at an incrementalist trickle and living standards remain stable, however, people don't really seem to mind much about small social changes that are gradually introduced. Meanwhile, a more openly progressive culture, and I don't necessarily mean progressive here as a synonym for positive, such as the US, can tolerate almost a century of massive social reform and change without really being all that bothered, although there does still seem to be a threshold, and this applies outside of America and Japan too, of course. Despite the West's current popular views on China, theirs is a system that has elevated massive amounts of people out of abject poverty and made their nation into an indisputable global power, despite demonstrable faults. The point is that when a nation is making its population wealthy and the people feel like their country is on the rise, a country can get away with a lot of sweeping change, such as that we saw in the Meiji era. But once wealth starts to only pool in elite hands, and there are a broader mix of anxieties about the nation falling behind, one of the first arrays of questions that seems to emerge is, do you remember when we didn't do things like this? Do you remember when things used to be better? Maybe we should get back to that. All of this is to say that Aikido was a throwback martial art when it was founded and was part and parcel to a larger, growing sentiment at the time. Of course, there is the problem that you fundamentally cannot actually go back in time. We don't operate on science fiction logic. Something that is interesting to me is that even internally, prominent Aikido people have said Aikido weapons work is basically trash, and this is a view I've grown to agree with. I have friends and martial peers who do swordsmanship both in the Koryu and in more competitive environments such as HEMA, and these guys pretty much universally agree that the sword work in Aikido is terrible. Frankly, I think with the context we've just explored, it should not come as a surprise, really. Wyatt Earp could have taught John Wayne how to quick draw, but in a world where the quick draw was an obsolete technology, Wayne would have likely only ever picked up the aesthetic shell of the form as opposed to its legitimate and lethal essence. Sure, he probably could have pulled it off on a firing range, but a duel is a different beast. Aikido, in this sense, wants to be everything that the Meiji values warrant. Aikido wants to be an Edo-era martial art, not a Meiji one. Even today, I feel more people come to Aikido wanting to delve into samurai-inspired aesthetics and esotericism as opposed to something like Judo. But the truth is that neither Takeda nor Ueshiba were samurai. No one in Aikido has ever been a samurai. In Aikido's effort to be an Edo period martial art, it has only managed to become an imperial Japanese martial art. Previously, we had established that while Judo and Karate were Meiji-era arts, Aikido was a throwback and part of a broader ultra-conservative reaction to the Meiji Revolution. In its efforts to basically be a Tokugawa period martial arts style, however, it really only managed to be the product of Imperial Japan. A powerful indictment here is that Aikido pretty quickly had to pivot after Japan's surrender, though. I mean, obviously it did, right? The art was washed of its ultra-nationalist and New Age religious overtones and rebranded primarily by the Aiki as something closer in nature to cooperative meditation in motion. It became something more akin to generic life enrichment. In fairness, Aikido isn't alone in this either, at least not completely. Judo began to take a hard left turn into sportification in the post-year wars. The American occupation of Japan had banned martial arts, but their ban may or may not have really been all that necessary. The Japanese people were already turned off by all things martial, and they associated martial arts with a regime that had led them down a path to ruin and starvation. While many of we judoka today bemoan how sportified the art has become, myself included to a degree, we also have to acknowledge that this direction really makes a lot of sense when we put it in context. The same can be said about karate proper. Sure, it had already been sanitized for Japanese mainlanders from the outset, but it should come as no surprise to us that karate had to first escape Japanese borders to get back to full contact sparring, at least broadly speaking in most mainstream styles. Japan was simply tired of fighting and perhaps was a bit more aware of how martial arts as an education system is a very thin line away from martial arts as an indoctrination system. As a kind of cruel joke, it seems like Aikido has only maintained some of its uglier features from that period. It has now replaced Ueshiba's grassroots ultra-right-wing religion with more Western New Age spiritualism. It is still largely a samurai LARP for many people. It still draws people looking for hidden secrets of a bygone era where there really isn't much to be found. But Aikido really isn't any of these things, and crucially, it never was. Aikido was a dated practice at the moment of founding because it was a callback to a time that had already come and gone. Yet, paradoxically, there is a subsection of people who argue that the way forward is to try and go back, just remixing Aikido's original sin. This is why I'm so critical of the idea that going backwards is somehow a pathway forwards. Aikido was founded on a similar premise, and even if it were very dubiously somehow a good idea then, very few would suggest where the art is now is all that good or healthy. I said towards the beginning of the series that no tree is ignorant of the climate it's grown in. The climate in this analogy is popular culture, and even more specifically, people themselves. There is a lot of noise about how to make Aikido more popular, but virtually none of that noise deals with what everyday people actually want from their martial arts practice. The reason for Judo's early success and BJJ's current American success is that these arts have a finger on the pulse of popular sentiment. Modern Aikido has simply failed to frame itself in a meaningful way for people in the 2010s and 2020s. This is not to disregard the possibility of a countercultural resurgence or another throwback period, but at the moment Aikido just stands in stark contrast to what most people find valuable in their training. Very few people would debate that reconciliation is good where possible, or that flowing with things outside of your control is just more efficient. But people don't need these specific Aikido techniques attached to this very specific martial system to reach those conclusions. The reason BJJ initially survived and thrived as a countercultural movement was because it offered something perceived as new that offered something contemporary people were interested in at the same time. Now, yes, much of BJJ was essentially a repackaging of early 20th century Judo, but Judo itself was just a repackaging of the jujitsu that predated it. While genuine martial innovations do sometimes grow out of these shifts, I think we often vilify the repackaging of martial arts a bit too harshly. Even as it pertains to Aikido, my own criticism is not that it is a streamlined Daito-ryu or a repackaged bunch of other techniques from other styles. My criticism is that it just doesn't offer much that other systems don't already offer, and what it does offer, you're typically going to find better instruction elsewhere. In my view, the most egregious feature of modern Aikido is that it often doesn't even really seem to buy into its own mythology. The post-World War II Aikido landscape was defined by a pivot, but this isn't the pivot you'll often hear about from casual Aikido practitioners. Popularly, the story you're likely to run across goes something along the lines that Ueshiba, the founder, saw the error of his ways through the lens of a brutal outcome in World War II. Sometimes this shift in character is even pushed as far back as his poorly documented time during the Russo-Japan War, but ultimately the story goes this change of perspective made his techniques softer and his philosophy more peace-loving. While the narrative power here is palpable and understandable, none of it is true. A criticism some of my Aikido videos occasionally draw is that much of what I discuss has been known about in research circles for years and years. This is one of those myths that has been debunked almost like a rite of passage for newer Aikido researchers. The reason I bring these things up is that there are still people parroting the myth, both inside and outside the art. But I'm going to save this particular issue for the very end of the video though, so let's put a pin in that. The research shows Ueshiba's technique remained more or less the same, and if any new quote-unquote softness was to be found in there, it likely had much more to do with his now advanced age than some underlying ideological shift. We also know there was no such ideological shift happening at all to begin with. Ueshiba maintained his ultra-right-wing connections for the remainder of his life. People really, really want Ueshiba to be some sort of pacifist sage warrior, but literally nothing in the historical record suggests that he ever was. This does lead us smoothly into some of the post-war adjustments made by the Aiki, particularly through Ueshiba's son, who took over after his father's de facto retirement. A point I want to make about the second-generation head of Aikido, though, is that he doesn't appear to have been the first choice. In fact, Mochizuki Minoru was once approached to take over Aikido, but rejected the offer, likely because he sensed rough waters ahead and was probably already formulating his own ideas about what martial arts practice should be. Another man, Nakakura Kiyoshi, was also in line to become Ueshiba's successor and even married his daughter at the behest of Ueshiba himself, a common practice when passing on the position of a style's head. Nakakura's reason for departing Aikido is a bit more obscure. He mentioned something about not being good enough to carry on the legacy, but this to me sounds like humble Japanese language disguising a more grounded reason. Nevertheless, he abdicated his position as successor and returned to the kendo world, where he was already very successful and very famous. I bring this up for a couple reasons, although keep in mind the following is very much my own speculation. While the accepted history is that Ueshiba's son and eventual successor, Ueshiba Kishomaru, was too busy with his own career to take over at first, this has never really sat all that well with me. Given the rigid conservatism in these martial arts circles, I suspect the founder likely could have forced the issue with his son, who was his own blood. Instead, he chose to pursue at least two other potential successors, and he had to go outside of the family and jump through some extra hoops to do so. Again, this is my own speculation, but Kishomaru's ascension to the leadership of Aikikai feels more like the founder settled for him as opposed to choosing him out of recognition for technical or leadership prowess. If any kind of document exists that were to confirm my suspicions, I'd suspect it's probably kept well out of public view. At any rate, Kishomaru got to work fairly quickly. His father, at least according to hearsay and rumor, at least to my understanding, was displeased with the direction his son was taking Aikido, but if these rumors are to be believed, the disagreement probably was not born out of martial considerations. Kishomaru had correctly ascertained that Aikido would not be able to continue forward as an imperial ideology as previously discussed. While this was a very smart call on the part of the new Aikido head, his pivot into branding Aikido as a lifestyle practice was, at least in my opinion, a decision that has plagued Aikido ever since. I'm going to be clear here that the narrative control of Aikido's brand under Kishomaru almost makes me want to call it a cover-up. Now, that may sound terribly dramatic to my viewers, but the shoe sort of fits. Let me just run down a few examples here. Nowadays, it is widely known that Daito-ryu is the predecessor art of Aikido, but few modern Aikido people have been around long enough to remember the Aikikai's campaign to diminish Daito-ryu's importance. Takeda Sokaku, Daitoryu's founder, was often a mere footnote in official histories in the decades immediately after the war. The Aikikai even went so far as to edit things out in photos that went into newspapers so as to obfuscate Ueshiba's connections to Daitoryu. Takeda Sokaku wasn't even the only victim of this campaign. Ueshiba's own nephew, Noriaki Inoue, often credited as co-founding Aikido, is completely erased from Aikido canon. It was likely Noriaki and his family were the ones that funded Ueshiba's early martial arts career, and perhaps even introduced him to the Omoto-kyo religion. The aforementioned Mochizuki and Nakakura, the latter of whom even married Ueshiba's daughter, were also both curiously missing in official retellings and biographies. Other students, after a break with the Aikikai, also get written out. Tomiki Kinji and Shioda Gozo, for example, are among their number. Naturally, Ueshiba's right-wing connections are never even hinted at in these officially approved histories either. This was clearly a purposeful operation to wipe Aikido's slate clean and craft it into a more palatable brand. In fairness, Aikido is hardly the only art to have ever done narrative control like this. It's actually very common. The aforementioned Daitoryu is rife with myths, and its founding narrative is very difficult to believe. I won't spend too much time here unraveling it, but consider that Daitoryu claims it was founded some 400 years before the next oldest confirmed martial arts school in Japan. In reality, Daitoryu seems to have been entirely the invention of Takeda Sokaku. Similarly, UFC 1 was in many ways just an advertisement for BJJ and could also be seen as a form of narrative control by a style for larger marketing purposes. Going even further back, the Gracie's dojo storming random places with a camera in tow, completely unannounced, is a similar tactic in narrative control. Of course they're going to beat those guys, not just because BJJ is legitimate, but because they didn't even know that they were going to have a competitive match that day. It was hardly a fair setup. And while I cannot definitively prove that Judo used similar tactics, I do feel it is a little suspicious that the police tournament that really launched Judo into the stratosphere is related to us primarily through the Judo perspective. Documents that cover that day have never seemed to materialize out of any archives as far as I know. This very well could just be a coincidence, or maybe the records were destroyed or otherwise lost, but it is something I think about from time to time, and I do think Kano probably partook in some narrative control over his system. Again, this is a very common thing. I'm not trying to paint it as good or bad, just that there are clumsy ways to do it and perhaps slightly more correct ways to do it, even if it comes across today as a little bit ethically dubious. Returning to Aikido, I'd also like to point out here that the casting out of the talented teachers like Kenji Tomiki, Shioda Gozo, and the like, to me, was probably the singular greatest error of post-war Aikido. After the war, Aikido had this prime opportunity to actually be the thing it advertised it was, a philosophy of peace and cooperation. Yet, ironically and tragically, we saw it look at some of its brightest practitioners and label them as too different. I'm sure the animosity in many of these cases was indeed a two-way street. Having said that, surely there was a way for the Aikikai to approach these decorated Aikido experts and say, look, you want to do things your way, and while we might not do it that way at the headquarters dojo, we still want you with us because we value your perspective. How can we organize it in such a way that you can stay with the organization but still pursue your brand of Aikido? And if the individual still cut ties after that olive branch being extended, then of course it would be wholly on them. But broadly speaking, I don't think this seems to be what happened in most cases. These people seem like they were told to toe the line or hit the road. While I understand following the doctrine of the head of a style is considered traditional and accepted in Japanese martial arts, I believe Aikido was uniquely positioned to reject that trend on the basis of its ideological foundation in concepts like reconciliation, harmony, and cooperation. Yet instead, it chose excommunication, rivalry, and division, which, from where I sit, has always felt like a major betrayal of its core principles. Even with Aikido rebranding itself, it's still playing out its founding mistake as a traditionalist throwback by committing to these excommunications. The underlying message here is clear. Aikido is all for peace and cooperation, just so long as the right people are at the top and calling the shots. And like I mentioned in the previous part, this does parallel nationalist sentiments of Imperial Japan as well, which styled itself as a stabilizing, peacekeeping force, while setting up a so-called co-prosperity sphere in East Asia. The fine print, of course, was that peace was for all so long as the right people, Japan in this case, were at the top and calling the shots. A further irony here is that the Aikikai's campaign of narrative control was largely a reaction to the early success of the Yoshinkan Aikido system. Rather than reach out to Shioda and the Yoshinkan to figure out a mutually beneficial compromise that respected the agency of both the Aikikai and Yoshinkan, the Aikikai was clearly threatened by Shioda's rise, so threatened in fact that their early demonstrations were formulated as a direct reaction to Yoshinkan demonstrations. The Aikikai, which brands Aikido as an art that supposedly rejects competition here, has the first inclination to try and outcompete the Yoshinkan instead of reconciling or compromising with them. Now, keep in mind that Ueshiba's supposed no competition philosophy is actually pretty overstated these days. He actually said very little about competition in the grand scheme of things, and what he did say wasn't even unique to Aikido. Both Judo and Karate's founders basically were both in the same camp and weren't all that fond of competition, at least for its own sake. I think Kano was smart enough to recognize, however, that it was sort of a necessary evil, because if he banned competition, students would just find their own way to compete in private. Put a pin in that too for a second, I'll come back to it very quickly. The point here is that Ueshiba didn't say much about competition, and what he did say wasn't an Aikido-specific trend. If anything, there is a body of circumstantial evidence that suggests Ueshiba was actually concerned about Aikido's clout in the competitive sphere. From developing techniques to counter Judo to tolerating Tamiki's interpretation of his art, the competitive approach to Aikido appears to have only been formally disavowed after Ueshiba was more or less out of the picture. A recent post made on the Sangenkai Facebook page shows Saito Morihiro writing that Ueshiba would secretly teach kaishiwaza to top students with shiai in mind, a word used specifically for competitive sports matches. Meanwhile, early students such as Kuroiwa clearly cared about the competitive dimension. Kuroiwa famously developed his hip throw to drop people directly on their heads, something developed to navigate potential dojo storming scenarios. Therefore, while the whole Budo movement more or less preached that martial arts were not for competition, that premise has clearly failed. Even in its own time, it proved a very difficult ideal to maintain. On that note, let's come back to that point about students finding a way to compete anyway in private. Even if someone like Kano didn't necessarily like sportified competition, there was an insightful recognition that if he failed to implement a competitive format, his students would find their own way in secret or informally to test themselves against one another, which ultimately meant the direction of the art would have been outside of the founder's purview. And for the record, I do think Kano understood the value of competition in marketing well, too. Again, look at the core events that led to Judo's popularization. Kano artfully made martial arts fit into the cultural paradigm contemporary to him, but also made sure his art was constantly winning, at least more than it lost, in bouts. Yoshinkan Aikido, on the other hand, follows a fairly Aikikai-like philosophy which tends to reject competition. However, some Yoshinkan lines out there do demonstration competitions. The Aikikai itself, while it doesn't have official competitions, I would argue still has soft competitions. As I've pointed out previously in my Aikido and aestheticization video, really the Aikikai competes through demonstration and aesthetics. No, they are not awarded points or medals, but they do gain reputation and advertise their schools through these public showings. Maybe if you wanted a metric, you could go look up some of the annual Aikikai demonstration videos and see which ones have the most views. Shirakawa Yuji comes to mind as someone who's sort of winning the popularity contest. What I'm getting at here is that pretty much every major Aikido dojo competes in some way. Competition, or the desire for it, is simply an inevitability of the martial arts space, especially where young people are concerned. Sit a group of them in a room and competition tends to organically arise on its own. And also, keep in mind that most of martial arts is made up of young people. It is a very young hobby, so of course competition follows naturally. The question is whether you want to consciously direct that energy or not. In the Aikikai's case, they opted not to. The result is now a system where de facto competition happens at aesthetics-based demonstrations, and therefore demonstration is what students are incentivized to train for. The post-war ideology of non-competition has not only been heavily contradicted by Aikido's organizations and actions and dealings, but in my view has outright failed just across the board more generally. Nor is this even going into the issue where some dojos have a very insular, almost incestuous tendency to claim that their specific approach is quote-unquote most correct and therefore better than their peers. It isn't too difficult to find stories among some dejected Aikido people about how they have been berated from time to time about a foot being slightly off angle or somehow they're moving too forcefully. While quality standards are indeed important, many Aikido schools are Puritan along very semantic lines, which again feels like it spits in the face of this style being about harmony, cooperation, and so on and so forth. This style, more than any other Budo, I feel is the most ideologically positioned to be a very creative and open project. In practice, it somehow manages to be even more calcified and closed off than many of its peers. The tendrils of Aikido's post-war narrative reconstruction did not remain confined to Japan. It really began to take off on the American mainland in the years after the war, during the era of Woodstock and free love. I've not really seen this connection too deeply explored anywhere else to my knowledge, but I've long suspected this combination is no coincidence. Remember, this was also a time when East Asian philosophy was broadly being romanticized and perhaps we might say fetishized in general by Americans. Inside the new artificial canon that the Aikikai had crafted, a young generation of Westerners found a supposedly peace-loving philosophy that felt vaguely like a path to save the world and towards utopianism. It was this interaction, in my opinion, that transformed the lifestyle art that the Aikikai had curated into an almost new age religion for certain Western adherents. In the process, Ueshiba's casting as a saint-like figure reached its apotheosis, and his cult of personality went international. Some in my audience might wonder if Kishomaru's transformation of his father's rightist ideological Aikido was really such a bad thing, though. After all, even if it isn't historically rooted in pacifism, if it is now actually about such values, can't the overreach of the Aikikai's narrative control be at least somewhat forgiven? In 2023, the 61st All-Japan Aikido demonstration was opened by one Yamatani Eriko. She is openly connected with the Nippon Kaigi, an organization and lobby that is deeply revisionist. It advocates abolishing gender equality laws, decreasing the separation of state and religion, monarchism, increased militarism, and the denial of comfort women, alongside such things as the characterization of historical Japanese imperialism as liberation of East Asia from Western powers, and of course the all-time classic denial of the atrocities that took place in Nanjing. The point is that the Aikikai still, after all these years, seems to maintain deeply far-right ultra-nationalist connections. And just for my American viewers who are probably desensitized to these kinds of terms due to our news cycle, I mean these guys are pretty much in the camp of restoring Imperial Japan straight up. They are very much the real deal in that sense, and openly so. I did not have to do some sort of journalistic deep dive to get this information. It's on their English language Wikipedia page. I want everyone to keep in mind that Aikido is not filled to the brim with people who believe these things, though. Most practitioners, even in Japan proper, are likely completely oblivious to such questionable connections. They, too, are swept up in the veneer of Aikido as a peaceful project aimed at lifestyle enrichment. It seems to me that these types of relationships really only exist at the highest level, and even then they tend to exist quietly. Finally, I feel a bit obligated to discuss where Aikido can go from here, because really, this was a single long essay pointing out all the critical errors found in the art across its existence. I suspect some people might be ready to completely throw the art away at this point. What I want to focus on here is that the techniques in Aikido aren't unique to Aikido and still deserve to be experimented with. Personally, I'm not all that interested in being part of the big organizations and politics anymore. While I mostly discuss the Aikikai in this video, really every Aikido style has this traditionalist impulse that it can't quite seem to shake. Even if an organization doesn't come with all the ideological baggage, every style now very much wants to maintain its image. Sometimes that's through aesthetics, sometimes that's through pedagogy, but either way, there's very little room for going on your own side quests in my experience. Broadly speaking, I think Aikido's critical failure is that it just doesn't speak to people well, even internally. Earlier, I mentioned that a fairly common criticism of my channel is that I really am just bringing research that has been out there for a very long time to YouTube. And this is true, but frankly, I think it's clearly necessary. The research arm of martial arts is fairly fresh in a broad sense. Only recently have martial arts academic journals begun to pop up and be taken somewhat seriously. But even beyond that, if this research were truly so accessible and broadly understood, we'd see the history be better understood in Aikido dojos. And as a result, we would see Aikido have to come to terms with the fact that its approach to marketing itself has largely been a failure. The whole peace and anti-competition bit seems to have been entirely fabricated. The campaign against competition has largely failed, and there isn't really a strong correlation between why these specific techniques in Aikido manifest those specific ideals to begin with. Judo broadly preaches the same sorts of things: martial arts as an education, mutual benefit and prosperity, and, at least historically, a quiet disdain, if not begrudging acceptance, of competition. Beyond that, Judo also advertises similar technical qualities, such as technique overcoming strength, to name one. Judo is an international success, and despite its many issues, it maintains its place as one of the world's premier grappling systems. Aikido, meanwhile, is just barely limping along and does not seem to be improving. I see more Aikido people scoff and make excuses for this state of affairs relative to Judo than genuinely interrogating themselves on why Judo has been so successful, whereas Aikido has not been. The future of Aikido, in my opinion, is first and foremost about getting the research out of academic papers, blogs, and closed group pages and into the hands of everyday Aikido practitioners. We still need the researchers and the like, don't get me wrong, but all that work won't mean much unless it's actually incorporated into Aikido culture more generally, and this extends outside of the art as well. I am thrilled to report that I'm in touch with people all over the globe at this point through this channel. Not something I set out to do or expected, but something that has been achieved somehow. Many of these people do not do Aikido either, but many have seen my little hobby side project here and have either been inspired to play with Aikido ideas or techniques, or at least have come to understand the art better than just the cultural punchline that it often is. I love getting comments from Aikido people, don't get me wrong, but I really get excited to see comments from people who are like, I've never done Aikido in my life and I'm really not all that interested, but this was interesting and I learned something. In essence, I'm saying step one is Aikido needs to incorporate this knowledge that is so freely available out on these research pages and in books into its mainstream discourse and narrative. Step two is building a better marketing arm, which I know some martial arts people detest, but let's just be realistic. Every successful martial art markets itself. Aikido has just historically done it rather poorly because it's basically an art designed with the imperial Japanese context as a starting point. People like underdog stories. I was just watching a Martial Geeks video, link in the description, a few days back, and one of his commentors was like, holy crap, you got Kotegaeshi to work in sparring. As much as people like a dead horse to beat on the internet, a surprising amount of people, I think, want Aikido techniques to be effective, and why wouldn't they? It's just more options for them. In the same vein, though, whatever narrative Aikido might craft for itself, it needs to approach it honestly. I personally have zero qualms for aesthetics-based cooperative demonstration Aikido. I'd teach that class alongside the martial stuff because, frankly, I think it's fun. But it would be clearly labeled Aikido demonstration class. As I age, I certainly am more interested in the physical culture side of Aikido and martial arts more generally, and making sure that my quality of life remains high into older age. I like sparring, still, very much, but I also want to be doing this forever, ideally. Aikido can actually have its cake and eat it too here. Plenty of people would join up and go to great lengths just to do cool-looking things. What are skills-based calisthenics or gymnastics if not fitness for the sake of doing really cool-looking stuff? There is a market for that just as much as there is a market for combat sports. Finally, Aikido needs to introspect and ask itself what it can deliver to people today that other arts don't. What is going to get people into Aikido dojos when a Muay Thai place or BJJ place is right next door? And historically, I think the answer to this has been Aikido's ideology, but again, no one is biting on that line anymore. Ironically, I think framing competition against other martial arts is probably the wrong route. Maybe a better question is why aren't more Aikidoka engaging with broader martial arts in the landscape? Where are all the Mochizukis or Kuroiwa types these days who aren't just Aikidoka, but karateka and judoka and boxers and whatever else? It might be useful if Aikidoka could actually sit down and have a meaningful conversation with other people in their own gyms about martial arts, because right now, Aikido people do not usually get thought of as being normal, but instead ideologues and cultists. Also, I know that some Aikido people will scream at the sky and say the world is wrong and that they just don't understand Aikido, but, that's a very, very juvenile way to approach your marketing strategy. At the risk of repeating myself, I really want to hammer home that Aikido people must do a better job at presenting themselves to the space. Aikido is an art largely viewed as filled with ideologues, cultists, and just delusional people. And the fact of the matter is that there are shreds of truth in that. I hate to say it, but it just is. Aikido does tend to be closed off and Puritan. We still have people out there who genuinely believe Ueshiba was a warrior saint, despite the research that proves otherwise being a Google search and about 10 minutes away. The heart of the matter is that I cannot tell you what the future of Aikido is. What I am confident in predicting, however, is that on its current path, it will continue to age out and contract into a very niche art for very, very niche people. To course correct, Aikido needs to be more open and more honest with itself, both intellectually and practically. I'm not arguing we dismiss tradition. In fact, my own view is that severing our connection to tradition would be a mistake. But we also have to reconcile with the reality that our traditions are not these snow-white triumphal things. Aikido's origins are mired in ideas and circumstances that don't serve modern people. Arguably, they didn't even serve past people all that well. So I'll conclude with the same questions as before. In 2025 and beyond, what can Aikido deliver to people that other martial arts do not? Why choose Aikido? And when you answer that, how are you going to communicate the value of that special thing to people both inside and outside the art? Because as useful as the research circles have been for those of us already deeply invested, Aikido has certainly not taken these findings to heart more popularly. The state of affairs I see among many Aikido people is to just keep doing the same thing we always have been. And clearly, that just fails. Anyway, thank you all for listening. This was a behemoth project to get out, so I appreciate your being here and making it to the end. As always, this channel isn't possible without you, the viewer, so I am genuinely grateful for your attention and your interactions. And I will see you all in the next one. Peace.